Hi, folks. So, in our animal behavior class in lecture F3, we cover prey choice decisions by animals and the many things that may drive what causes an animal to ignore certain prey items that it has encountered or decide to eat them. And towards the end of the lecture, we finally get to gut constrained foraging. And it is something that we sometimes don't have a lot of time to cover in detail within the class. So, I wanted to build this little auxiliary module on gut constrained foraging to try to better understand a core model that is used to help predict the decisions that animals will make when they've got a constrained gut and they're dealing with a lot of bulky food items. And so a great example of that are these molluscivore shorebirds, like this red knot right here. They eat, mollusks, and mollusks have a bunch of these really bulky shells here. And so whereas humans have adaptations to deal with these, if you are a shellfish eater, you've got your fingers that you can use to pry open these shells, get the meat out, throw the shells away, and then you can eat the meat without having to worry about what to do with these shells. That's not the adaptive route that these shorebirds have taken. So for them, they can't easily discard the shells, so they just have to eat the shells. And they then have special portions of their digestive system that are made to deal with those. And so the gizzard, for example, is a specialized organ or stomach used for grinding up food and grinding up all of these shell pieces so that they can eventually process these shells, break the meat out, use the meat, and then pass the shells through so that they don't have to actually try to metabolize these shells. So they have to get rid of this stuff. But the gizzard only works at a limited rate, or it has an upper bound on how fast it can clear food. So when we're talking about the handling time for these prey items, we are not only talking about the time it takes just to open them up and get the meat and down the meat, but it's also the time for the system to process all of this shell that goes through there. So the animal would, you would imagine selection should choose for behaviors that optimize the amount of energy per unit time that it's able to get from its foraging decisions, but also should be sensitive to this limit on how much ballast or bulk that the animal's body can process as it's eating these mollusks with these big bulky shells. And it doesn't have to be mollusks with shells. This could be if you're eating leaves, for example, that have a lot of toxins in them, there might be something you get out of the leaves, and it's advantageous to get more and more of that. But as you eat more of the leaves, you accumulate toxins from the leaves, and your body needs to clear those toxins at a particular time. And if that physiology has an upper bound on how many toxins it can clear, then you have the same sort of problem. So there's a bunch of different types of digestion constrained, gut constrained, capacity constrained foraging that falls under this approach, which we're just going to talk about in the specific context of this red knot. But again, you can think of it as more broad, more general. All right, so for this particular case, now we've got a bunch of different prey types. And when we talked about prey choice in the classical optimal foraging theory sense, each prey type had a gain and a handling time. So these are lumped prey. This isn't the patch model. So you need to take this much handling time in order to get this much gain, this many calories out of it. But now what we're adding to that is that every one of these shells, every one of these preys here, they have a certain amount of bulk or ballast, like the shell, for example. And again, this could be a toxin that's in them as well. There could be other things that are like this, but there's this a third dimension on which to consider each one of these prey here. And so before, when we only had gain and handling time, we found that the optimal solution, the one that would be predicted that if the animal was making decisions that were selected to optimize for long-term rate of gain, then we figured out that there is this profitability ratio that we would predict would give the ordering of the prey items so that those with high profitability would always be eaten, and those with low profitability would only be eaten if the ones with high profitability weren't very available. That's the prey model. That's also the 0-1 rule to sort of suggest that there is a set of prey that are always eaten and a set of prey that are always ignored, and the fence post between the two sets depends on the encounter rate with the ones that are being eaten. So, but now that we have bulk, we have sort of an analogous thing to profitability, this what I'm calling digestive load rate. It's bulk per unit time. So this is if you've eaten this object, it takes this much time to clear your system, and it is going to put this much bulk load on your system, this much ballast, this much bulk has to go through your system in this much handling time. So we have these two ratios that we need to think about. And so we need to figure out how to make prey choice decisions where we, instead of just having this one simple sorting here, profitability, where we come up with a threshold for profitability that above that you take and below that you don't, we need to figure out how do we incorporate both of these ratios together. So a model that was dreamed up for this. It was based off of optimal foraging theory, but then added these constraints in, was by Hirakawa. And back in around 1995, there were a couple of different papers that came out around this time about this model. And I'm going to give a simplification of the ideas here. And this is the same model that is used in more recent work to evaluate how birds like these red knots make foraging decisions. And we're going to see an evaluation of how well they do with the very last slide. All right, so the way the Hirakawa model works, which remember, this is just meant to be take what we already know about optimal prey choice from classical optimal foraging theory and the prey model, and we're expanding that to include these constraints. And so the idea is here, now imagine we have a two-dimensional axis here where we've got energy intake rate, calories per second, or watts, so basically power here, the power we get in from foraging. That here is on the vertical axis. And as we're going to see in a second, that's very much like our profitability scoring. And then on the x-axis, this is the new thing, ballast intake rate. So this is how much bulk that we're taking in. So we've got how much energy we're taking in per second and how much bulk we're taking in per second. So this teardrop shape here, if you imagine every single way that you could make prey choice decisions based on our options, then it fills out this space, this interior space here. So the idea here is that you've got prey of different types that have different encounter rates. And you could decide that maybe 20% of the time I'll take prey one, 30% of the time I encounter prey three, I'll eat it. 40% of the time I encounter prey five, I'll eat it, and so on. Those percentages for each prey type, you could imagine swinging those around from 0 to 100% for all of them and combining them all together, and you would fill out this space here. So these are all of the possible diet combinations, or in other words, all of the possible ways that from your diet, you could combine a energy intake rate, so calories per second from your whole diet, with a ballast intake rate, grams per second for your whole diet. And so what we see here is that there are bounds for both of those. And so this first bound that you see here, this basically is like what you see in Holling's disk equation or Holling's disk model, where there's an encounter rate with prey, which is important, but there's a handling time that ultimately limits the ability for you to get an infinite amount of energy from the environment. And so even if your environment is extremely plentiful, there is a limit because every time you grab a prey, you'd have to take time to eat it, and that's going to slow things down. And so the encounter rate with the objects combined with the handling time of the objects, those two things combined, and there is a set of energy intake rates, which is just naturally impossible to reach. Either there's just not enough of them in the environment, or your handling time is such that you're just never going to reach that. So this is like the upper bound that you see from that Holling's disk equation. But we also get that in the case of our ballast intake rate. And so there's certain shells that are associated with each one of our prey types in this case here. And regardless of what your internal constraints are, just based on the fact that there's going to be space in between these prey items. It's going to take a while to go from one prey item to the next. And just because as you're eating one prey item, you're not encountering other prey items. So those two things together combine, again, in the same way we saw in kind of Holling's disk equation, so that you get an upper bound on the ballast intake rate provided by the environment. There's just no way to get more than this upper bound of grams per second. It's never going to arrive that fast to the actual physiology of the animal. So that's what defines the boundaries of this teardrop shape here. And then the rest of this interior of this teardrop are different ways you could combine that diet. So you don't fill out this whole rectangle. You can, if you don't eat anything, you're going to be down here. If you choose to only eat certain things, then you fill out different portions of this teardrop. And when we look at this, if we do not have any gut constraints, and then optimal foraging theory suggests we should sit at a diet that is at this point right up here. This diet will maximize our long-term energy per unit time, our long-term rate of gain of energy. And so that's what's on this axis here. And we're saying that this point up here, there is saying of all the diets you could pick, there is one diet that maximizes your rate of return in terms of energy gain. And if we draw a little horizontal line here to this axis, this defines our profitability ordering and our profitability threshold. So that long-term rate of gain becomes that threshold on so things that have a profitability that is higher than that long-term rate of gain, those are going to be included in the diet. Things that have a profitability that's lower than that will be excluded from the diet. That's just the standard prey model. So right there, if you have no gut constraint, you just get the prey model back. And so I can plot that here where I can say, well, I'm going to take all of my prey types and I'm going to plot them on this axis. And so because I have this additional dimension, I'll go ahead and plot their ballast intake rate here as well. But if I just focus on their kind of projection onto this energy axis, then the view kind of from going from right to left into this energy axis is the prey model. So I've got my included prey types and my excluded prey types in this horizontal line, which goes to this long-term rate of gain. This optimal long-term rate of gain is what separates the included from the excluded. That's just the prey model. But we're suggesting that the physiology of this animal cannot process bulk any faster than now this vertical line here, this ballast intake right here. So if you try to process this many shells per second or this many grams of shell per second, your body just can't do it. And so it will be impossible for it to ingest any of those things. The gizzard will just prevent that from happening. So what will happen? Well, if your choice of inclusion is based off of this profitability threshold, then we're still going to have these items included in the diet up here and these excluded in the diet. But the gizzard is going to veto individual items as they come in if there's not enough room in the gizzard. So if there's no room in the body to take that prey item in, it won't be eaten. So the the choice, which prey items you're selecting, still will give you a certain gain to bulk ratio. So that's what I'm depicting in this dotted line here. So there is a list of diets that you could pick that have the same gain to bulk ratio. And you're shooting for this particular gain to bulk ratio up here at the tangent here at the very, very top. So you're saying if I wasn't gut constrained, I would shoot for this particular diet where these green ones are the ones that are included and these pinkish ones are the ones that are excluded. And that's going to give me a certain gain to bulk ratio. That is my optimal diet gain to bulk ratio. But then your gizzard kicks in and it says, nope, I can't take that much bulk. So you maintain the gain to bulk ratio, but you scale down the amount of bulk that you can take, which means you're going to scale down the amount of gain as well. So what diet you end up with would be this interior one right here, where it is now decreased in the energy that is returned to the animal. So even though you're accepting these and rejecting these, your gizzard is rejecting some of both because it just can't fit some of them in. And so you end up down here at this suboptimal diet. So, what we really want is to say, how do we maximize our energy intake rate subject to this constraint? So, what we really want is this diet up here. And that's what I've got on this slide, which I accidentally went forward in a second ago. And so, that is the gut constrained optimal diet that maximizes the energy intake rate subject to an upper bound on the digestive rate here, on the ballast intake rate. And so that then puts us over here at this point in this curve, by the way. And by the way, sometimes we call these curves around these feasible regions. This is technically something that you can interpret as what's called a Pareto frontier. It kind of goes beyond the scope of this lecture, but that's the idea. There's a frontier. It's the edge. The best you can do here. It's in terms of increasing both of these things. And so we kind of have to move along that frontier over to here. And there is this new tangent line that is angled now at this point. So when we were at the top, it was horizontal. That was the tangent line. But over here, this tangent line has got a little bit of an angle to it. And it turns out that tangent line at this particular point, that defines the threshold between which prey to include in the diet and which to exclude. So all along this edge up here, the tangent line that is formed, this blue dashed line that is formed, which we're now calling the optimal diet line, that gives you that threshold that we started out with in the prey model, which was the long-term rate of gain, the max long-term rate of gain. That's what we use as a threshold for profitabilities. In this gut constrained model, as the gut constraint moves you from that optimal in terms of just pure energy or pure energetic rate point down, it tilts the optimal diet line from horizontal to having some angle. And that tilt will start to include, like this green prey item here, in the unconstrained version, like I had before, that was excluded. And then likewise, notice this green one up here is included, but in our new model, this previously green one is now pink, it's excluded, and this previously pink one is now green. And so now you see the animal making very different diet choices because now with these diet choices, even though this green one has a lower profitability and this pink one has a higher profitability, this green one is smaller. It has less bulk. So there's less bulk per unit time you have to process. And that trade-off, you're getting rid of calories per unit time, but you're getting rid of calories per unit time, but you're also getting rid of bulk per unit time. And that means that whereas your gizzard would have to reject this big thing over here, which has lots of calories, but also lots of bulk, and then your gizzard sits partially empty because it's not able to process at its maximum rate, this allows you to fit stuff in that gizzard still. And that then, even though there's slightly lower profitability, you end up actually doing better in terms of your energetic intake rate because this thing that had higher profitability just wasn't feasible because of the size of the gizzard. So that's how that optimal diet line works. And so the other interesting prediction that comes out of this is not only do prey choices shift and you start accepting these prey items that have lower profitability, but also a lower ballast intake rate or a lower digestive load rate. What also happens is this interesting phenomenon of partial preferences. And so if we imagine this kind of red squiggly line, that's the gizzard of a bird. And at this particular moment in time, it's got these two mollusks that have these two shells in it, and another couple of mollusks with these shells here. Now the gizzard's full. And so we might look out at all of the prey choices that animal could have made at that instant of time, and we notice that they're of this particular type of mollusk, then we're taking in 40% of the 100% that are out there. So there are 5 shells that are out there, and the bird seems to ignore 3 of them and eat 2 of them. And then likewise, with a little bit of space left over, there are, both of these sets of shells that are out there, and it eats half of what's available, and then its gizzard is full. And so, due to this gizzard that is thinning the arrival process of these shells, it's filtering some out and leaving some in. The gizzard is vetoing, as we see there. Then we get the appearance of so-called partial preferences, the emergence of partial preferences. So there will be some of these prey types, and it's hard for me to point out exactly which ones on this graph. They are likely going to be close to this line, and probably close to this point here. So they might be in a couple of, around this region. So it's most likely that prey items that are way out here, these are probably the ones that are going to be close to 100%, because they just provide a whole lot of energy that is overcomes the bulk constraint and everything else. But the ones that are down closer to this line, then they, sometimes there's they're going to be the ones that won't always necessarily be in the gizzard, because they're not always being chosen. And when there's room, then at some point, is there enough room for them? And so again, it's hard to say from this picture which one of these are going to have the partial preferences. But the point here is that you've got a set of prey items that are included in the diet, and you can basically think that even though they are included in the diet, they're not included in a 0-1 sense. So that seems to be a violation of the classic prey model. And if you go back to look at some of the original tests of the prey model, where there were other birds, but birds been given, mealworms on conveyor belts and things like that, something that we talked about earlier in lecture F3 about the classic tests of the classic prey model. Those tests were pretty convincing that the prey model was onto something, but you still saw for some birds what looked like partial preferences. So a lot of birds would be close to 100% on their high profitability types, but then there would be some birds that never quite could get past 70%, for even though there was a bunch of these high profitability types. And models like this, modifications of the prey model like this, that extend things so that you start considering the gut constraints of the animal. Even if an animal doesn't have a gizzard, they have a finite amount of space in their gut. And so, and there could be other toxicity constraints, there could be other things going on that have that less to do with the calories and more to do with other properties of the food that create these constraints. We saw that, when you put a sodium constraint on a moose, then it starts eating a bunch of things you would never expect it to eat. So it starts eating a bunch of bulky aquatics in order to get the sodium out of it. And that's a better match for what you see on real moose. Whereas if you used a purely calorie-based model, then it would ignore those bulky aquatics and only be eating a lot of leaves. So, why is a moose such a generalist? It's in part because it has more constraints than just its energetic needs. It has sodium needs and so on and so forth. And so that's what I'm trying to get at here, is that the classical prey model has explained a lot of variance, a lot of the patterns, the previously unexplained patterns that we could see in animal foraging. But it didn't get 100% of the way there. And models like these, modifications of models like these, like this one from Hirakawa, help us get a lot closer. And I want to close with a small demonstration of that, where in this paper that's up here, they did a test of this gut constrained model relative to the prey model for red knots like these. So down the left here, we've got distributions of prey inclusion, so basically the diets of red knots across multiple sites. And so in this column here, so each one of these are different things that the different prey types that the bird could be including in its diet. So these are the observed proportions. So so birds at this site, for whatever reason, this is the diet that they pick. Birds at this site, for whatever reason, this is the diet they can pick. You can see that these related sites have kind of similar diets. These sites have kind of similar diets, which suggests that the availability of these prey may have something to do with their inclusion in the diet. Fine. So, but this is the actual numbers from the real birds. These are the predictions based on encounter rates with the prey types at those sites. You could calculate what the Hirakawa model, what the gut constrained model would predict. And you find that they match up pretty well. The black bars means that they did a statistical quantification of how close this distribution was with this distribution. And if the model's bars are black, then that means that there is very little to no difference between these distributions. And so you can see across all of these sites, the gut constrained model explains the variation or predicts the variation. So if you know the encounter rates with the prey types, you can predict what the diet's going to be. Now, if you use the standard prey model, then you find that there's a lot of these white bars, which indicate a significant deviation from what was observed. Now, it still gets in the neighborhood. I mean, if you look down here, you see that at this site, the prey model does a pretty good job predicting which ones are the majority players in the diet. So this HYD1, that's a majority player. Likewise, a majority player here does a really good job at this site here, but not so great a job at some of these other sites. So the prey model, which does not consider the gut constraints, can make predictions, but those predictions do not, they get us a lot closer to explaining the observed variation, but they don't quite get us all the way there. When we take the insights of the prey model and then add additional constraints from the known limitations of the gizzards of these animals, so then we end up getting a much better model. So we're constantly trying to explain more and more unexplained variants. That's really science right there. And that brings us to this last message before I let you go is that when we're looking at animal foraging, there are a lot of things that can drive animal foraging, and we would like to figure out how to account for those things. And so how do we do that? Well, a lot of times we have to find the right animal where we know that this particular thing. So in the moose, we know they're strongly sodium limited. We know in the red knot that gizzard is a significant limitation. Looking for these special animals, these so-called model organisms, helps us, like a microscope, zoom in on particular aspects of the problem so that we can see if our overall model of how foraging works has properly accounted for that problem. If we just pick an arbitrary animal that we don't understand its limitations or it's co-limited lots of different ways, then it's really hard to be able to properly evaluate the impact of one thing or another. But if we combine what we know about the moose, what we know about the red knot, what we know about the yellow-eyed junco, and so on and so forth, so if we combine all of those things together, different things that we study, then we can use each one of them as a microscope that has sort of been tuned to a different focal depth or a different magnification, and then gradually assemble all of those into a story which tells us a more generalizable message about all of the animal kingdom. It helps us better understand even ourselves, our own diet choices. Why am I, always eating salad before my other meals? Well, probably because salad is so bulky that if you put it in the mix with everything else, that my natural diet preferences are not going to choose to eat it. But if you make it the only thing to eat, then I'll start taking it in. Those sorts of things. And so we try to assemble all of these things together to better understand the many, many different drivers of animal behavior that even in organisms that we do not necessarily study because they're too complex to study, the organisms that seem simple, well, it's actually a benefit that they're simple because it allows us to focus on one thing and then another thing and then another thing so that then we can bring all of those one, two, three things together to better understand a complex organism that is a lot harder to make inferences about if we just studied it immediately alone. Okay, that's all that I've got for you today. And so hopefully that was a little more helpful than maybe the rushed approach that we had to take in class, because this stuff comes up at the very end of that lecture F3.